If you have watched many of my older videos, then you will have come to realize that the Dead by Daylight of today is far different from what it was many years ago. Way back then, there were significantly fewer characters and perks. The many systems that we have come to love had not existed then, and the balance was far more questionable than it is currently. As a result, many people tend to look away from this era of Dead by Daylight, and instead look towards the present and future content, and continue to complain about their respective issues. Now, there is nothing entirely wrong with looking towards the present and future content. After all, we are the unlucky ones who have to deal with their respective antics. But by only looking towards the present and future, we forget the importance of past content that helped shape the current direction of the game. We would have never gotten map, perk, and offering updates if we ignored the many instances of their abusive or oftentimes forgettable nature. Nor would we have received character reworks as great as Doctor and Hillbilly if it wasn't for the errors learned from other character rework failures. As a result, the past is a very important reminder of how to improve mistakes that existed and how to make the game better, both from the good that each chapter brought, along with the bad. Out of all the chapters to arrive within Dead by Daylight, there is one chapter that truly stands the test of time, shaping the game unlike any other, and to me, it is one of the most important to ever release. It was a small chapter that did not necessarily leave a big impact when it first arrived, and even now many tend to forget its existence. But over the years, its importance has grown immensely, resulting in the introduction and the potential introduction of many systems within Dead by Daylight. As a result, I will not be carrying over my scale system from the previous legacy of a chapter, as this chapter's influence is truly immeasurable. Now, enough with me keeping you all in the dark, let's finally cover one of Dead by Daylight's most important chapters, that being Left Behind. Before talking about the perks, a brief glimpse into the history of the chapter's content would be an important thing to do, as the release of this chapter is one of the most unique within the game. Left Behind is a paragraph chapter that was released after the Of Flesh and Mud chapter with Hag and Ace, and it only included one survivor, that being William Bill Overbeck. Bill is a character from the game Left 4 Dead, a first-person co-op shooter created by the legendary company Valve. The main goal is to work with 3 other teammates to escape the impending swarm of zombies through shooting them down and reaching each campaign's escape route. An eerily similar structure to Dead by Daylight with its survivor count and looking for an escape. In any case, when Bill was released into the game, he belonged to one of the 3 chapters that Behavior ever made that were available to everyone for free. The only other 2 chapters that are free are the Last Breath chapter with Nia and Nurse, the first ever chapter, and A Lullaby for the Dark with David and Huntress, which was a community reward. Now, what makes this so interesting is that this is the only licensed chapter Behavior has ever made that was for free, and that is because of Valve. When Behavior went to make the licensing agreements to create Bill to celebrate the full release of Dead by Daylight on Steam, Valve stipulated that they wanted Bill to be available to everyone, and that everything made for Bill should not cost money. This relates to how Valve as a company celebrates their communities, who love their characters, as is seen with the source filmmakers and the modding community. As a result, it would feel strange to have one game not from Valve to force you to spend money to play as one of their most respected characters. Additionally, Valve at this point are quite literally covered with melted gold. They don't need any more money to cosplay as King Midas. As a result, every cosmetic for Bill, except the ugly sweater, were all earnable within Bill's tome or during the 8th year anniversary, and even after, both are currently purchasable with iridescent shards, the grindable currency for Dead by Daylight. The chapter releasing for free ended up being a blessing in disguise for Dead by Daylight 2, not only to bolster the character count for the base game, but also to bring to the table quick band-aid solutions for major problems the game was facing at the time, but more on that later. I first wish to talk about how special Bill and his chapter was, as this was the first ever paragraph chapter to be made in Dead by Daylight. It's rather funny to think about, considering it has become so common nowadays to see paragraph chapters, with the upcoming Walking Dead involving 2 survivors, but it all started with everyone's favorite gunslinging grandpa. Interestingly, some of the elements that we have seen in recent paragraph chapters were jump-started by the Left Behind Chapter 2, such as unique cosmetics. When Bill came to the game, all 4 of the original survivors received free outfits to make them look like characters from the Left 4 Dead universe. Every other paragraph chapter has only released cosmetics for their respective character, but there is one recent chapter to follow with the Left Behind cosmetic philosophy, that being Tokyo Ghoul, with the cosmetics having monetary costs, of course. Additionally, Left Behind as a chapter is a solid addition in the fact that when Bill arrived in the game, he brought perks that introduced something new. This is a philosophy that we have seen in many of the other paragraph chapters, examples including Ash vs Evil Dead with Medal of Man, Hour of the Witch introducing boons, Hellraiser introducing Scourge hooks, and Tomb Raider adding a unique vault animation through finesse. Another thing I wish to point out about Bill is that in the early days, he was quite a popular survivor. Similar to Meg, Bill was a character who pulled new players towards him, not only because of the perks he provided, but also due to how much he stood out from the survivor cast. When Bill arrived, the only survivors were Dwight, Meg, Claudette, Jake, Nia, Lori, and Ace. Compared to everyone, Bill stood out the most with being the visibly oldest, and also being from a game where you had to face zombies head-on. None of the other survivors, except for Lori, had to face any events like this in their lore, allowing him to stand out as a cool and battle-ready survivor. This, unfortunately, has aged poorly for Bill, as although he still stands out quite nicely from most of the cast, we have received many new survivors who have similar backgrounds with battling monsters. Survivors like the Resident Evil cast have faced zombies, same with the new Walking Dead cast too, and even the original cast have gotten characters who focus around facing threats, either eldritch or human-made. Additionally, new survivors have been added to tackle Bill with age as well, specifically David Tapp, Vittorio, Astree, Trevor with the Alucard skin, and the Witcher skin for Vittorio as well. As a result, the people who loved Bill have found many more options to gravitate towards, whether it be due to new themes, perks, or cosmetic options, as Bill is on the lower end of cosmetic releases due to his licensing nature. He is still a very well-beloved survivor within the game, don't get me wrong. He isn't as forgotten as someone like Bayomar, but compared to before, his play rate has significantly dropped. And I find that to be kind of a shame. But the popularity of characters can only go so far when it comes to lore and thematics. We now have the perks, which I have been talking about endlessly, but have been careful not to go into too much detail until now. Bill, like every other character in the game, released with 3 teachable perks, with 2 in particular having ripple effects on the game's core balance. I will start with the weakest of the 3 first, not only because its history is a lot smaller compared to the other 2 perks, but also because it is the easiest to discuss. Left Behind has had a few different designs over the years, so I will start with its oldest design first and move on to its most current effect. Before the perk was even known as Left Behind, there were sightings of another perk that Behavior were testing by the name of Last Standing, which can be seen on the Dead by Daylight wiki. Last Standing would gain 1 token for each survivor who left the trial by any means, increasing your action speeds by 25% per token. Now, as for what it increased, it's a little unknown. You see, this was during the olden days of Dead by Daylight, where perk descriptions were even more vague than they are now. So, if I had to take a wild swing at what it really meant, I suppose it increased the speeds of interactions of any kind, similar to how resilience works. Meaning that if all 3 survivors were out of the trial, you had a 75% increase to everything, including vaulting speeds. And we all know how much people cry over Finesse's 20. The perk never made it to live, for obvious reasons that I hope you all can see, but it did stay within the game's code, allowing hackers to apply the perk onto themselves quietly. Behavior would remove the perk from the code after the release of the Resident Evil patch, How timely of them. And anyone who was spotted running the perk before that era was permanently banned. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. And you better stop thinking about Sable, you sickos. But the other thing you are probably thinking about is whether an effect like Last Standing could actually exist within Dead by Daylight in the modern age. And that is a very tricky question. Last Standing was a very popular perk for hackers to abuse, as it gave them everything that they wanted, and that was very large number manipulations to all interactions. Nowadays, many hackers are more discreet about number manipulations, else they face the dreaded anti-cheat system, you know, when it actually works. But let's ignore hackers for now completely, and look at the perk on the game's base level. Last Standing is a perk that completely ignores the fact that the endgame is when the killer should feel their strongest, giving a huge chunk of power to a survivor, and if that survivor is good, they have pretty much become invincible. You may have noticed that endgame perks for survivors tend to be very quiet effects, such as with Wake Up, No One Left Behind, and even Hope, stab manipulators that are beneficial, but are rather quiet if the killer does not pay attention. Adrenaline is the only exception to the rule, but that is because the effect is instant and it is done once it activates. Last Standing completely ignores both of these philosophies for survivor endgame perks, being a very powerful stat manipulator that affects everything and is one that can activate even earlier than the endgame. If the numbers were more controlled, say 5% per token, or 15% when you were the only survivor standing, then I could see the perk existing within the game. But as for how it was first tested, this is an immediate no. Anyways, I am getting sidetracked. Let's return to the core topic of the video. As for how Left Behind was released, many of the veterans of Dead by Daylight know today that it had a completely different effect compared to Last Standing, but it followed a similar philosophy. Left Behind is activated once you are the last survivor alive, increasing your repair speeds by 25% per remaining generator. As a result, if all 5 generators were inactive when Left Behind activated, you had a 125% maximum repair boost. The perk would later on get a buff in patch 2.7.0, increasing the repair bonus from 25% to 75%, making the maximum now 375. But the issue the perk suffered from remained. Left Behind struggled to understand that since you were the last survivor standing, you were not running around repairing generators, as that would alert the killer to your presence and result in your death. A good perk to compare the old Left Behind with is Low Profile, a perk belonging to Ada Wong, as they both have similar activation clauses. Low Profile hides your scratch marks, grunts of pain, and pools of blood for 90 seconds when you are the only survivor not dying, hooked, or dead. As a result, the perk not only benefits you when attempting to avoid the killer's detection, but also helps you recover the team from terrible situations. Left Behind works differently, as it only activates when everyone else is dead, and the benefits it provided you were not beneficial enough to help you escape, as being the last survivor meant you had to find the hatch. Speaking about the hatch, Behavior introduced the hatch closing system in the exact same patch as the buff, and you cannot work on generators during the endgame collapse, making Left Behind quite literally a dead perk. Behavior would later on realize this flaw, and it was a very big flaw, and rework the perk in patch 3.2.0, changing the effects to instead reveal the hatch's aura when you were 32 meters away. This is a significantly better effect to have compared to before, as now the perk provides you a beneficial effect for being the last survivor left, and that is by revealing an escape route. Interestingly enough, the gen repair element would be moved onto Soul Survivor, which would be a much better perk to house the effect. The reason why it is better on Soul Survivor is to fulfill the thematic identity of Soul Survivor, as the perk is not designed so much for Dead by Daylight's meta play, instead it is designed to fulfill dramatic flair. Back to Left Behind though, it would end up seeing a decent chunk of play in solo escape streaks for many Survivor players, as knowing the hatch's location helped immensely to keep the streaks going. It also helped to fetch you an edge on locating the hatch, and even if the killer did close it before you could reach it, you would most likely have a key to reopen it. The only other changes the perk would receive would be with outside balance changes. specifically to the hatch's spawn logic and introducing hatch closing for the killers, with the nerfs to keys over the years, all of which are covered nicely in Ardetha's video, which you can find in the description. Outside of that, Left Behind is, well, left behind by the developers. The perk has not received a single change after the 3.2.0 patch, and the outside balance changes, if anything, hardly impacted the perk at all. The perk has also remained in the lower levels of play rate, but it does at least see some play to this day. If you were to ask me if I would buff the perk, I would immediately tell you no. Whenever I talk about perks in my most popular series, Why No One Uses, I always follow the philosophy of does a perk have a job and does it do it well? And Left Behind follows that philosophy very nicely. Left Behind does not cause any trouble, and if anything is a solid perk for the players who do want its value. And considering it does still see play, the value it provides still has its place in the modern day. It's not the greatest perk, but it gets its job done, and I cannot ask for more. The next perk on our list to discuss is one that, similar to Left Behind, did not receive many changes over its lifespan, but unlike Left Behind had a massive effect on the game, and at one point had the potential to be made as a core mechanic in the game. That, of course, is Unbreakable. And before I talk about its influence over the game, let's first cover its balance history, as it will be a very quick discussion point. When the perk was first released, it had the effect of allowing you to recover from the dying state once per trial, and have a 25% bonus self-recovery speed. The perk would later on get a really weird update on patch 1.8.1 to awaken you from the dream world against Freddy, because this was behavior back in the old days when they were really interested in what Clown put in these bottles. After they came back to their senses, to some degree, Unbreakable would receive its last update on patch 3.0.0, where the perk removed the dream effect and the recovery was increased to 35%. That is it. The perk has never received any changes outside of this patch, and to this day it remains one of the most popular perks within the game. If you were to look at nightlight.gg, it hovers around the top 20 perks in play rate, and often it breaches into the top 10. The reason for the perk's popularity is not a surprise either. Whether you look at the game in the past or even the present, the perk resolves a major issue that survivors face, and that is slugging. Back in the days of old, there were no anti-slugging perks. The only means of dealing with a slugging killer was with healing perks like botany knowledge, but that was not enough. Unbreakable was a complete game changer of a perk, finally providing a band-aid to a big problem, one that unfortunately would grow even further over time, and would split into many other different problems. I'm getting sidetracked again. Interestingly, the balance of Unbreakable would actually influence many of the other anti-slugging perks that have been made over the years, from the team play anti-slugs of We're Gonna Live Forever and Boon Exponential, to more selfish perks like Tenacity and the newest perk Conviction. What keeps Unbreakable apart from the other anti-slug perks, and what makes it so much popular, is the fact that it is a very simple activation. You can recover from the dying state once, and your recovery is faster. It not only helps you when your whole team is slugged, but also helps your team to pick you up sooner as you recover. The other anti-slug perks have the problems of overcomplicating their effects. It seems behavior have finally caught on with the We're Gonna Live Forever buffs of patches long ago. Additionally, Unbreakable is one of the only anti-slug perks to give a selfish option to disrupting slugging, which will always be a popular choice for players. Now, when it comes to covering the history of Unbreakable, there were 2 points where the perk would reach high moments of discussion, and the first is with a build that the Dead by Daylight community commonly called the small PP build. I discussed this in my previous Legacy of a Chapter video on Silent Hill, specifically with Soul Guard, as this was a build that had a huge point of contention within the player base. Many people argued that the build was completely unfair, a point that I would agree with, as it was one of the very many survivor builds that took control away from the killer side. The main issue with the build was not Unbreakable, but instead Decisive Strike, as the perk did not have its conspicuous clause as it has today, meaning survivors had a full 60-second immunity window, and if the killer dared to pick them up during that time, they received a full 5-second stun. As a result, the only way a killer could disrupt Decisive Strike was by slugging, which is where Unbreakable became a staple. If the killer decided to slug you to avoid the stun, then you could pick yourself up and continue progressing the game, resulting in a lose-lose situation for the killer. There was also the instances where survivors could force you to grab them, whether through slow vaulting or jumping into a locker, a common strategy that is still done today. Behavior would realize the problem was not from Unbreakable, instead it was from the malicious flaws that creeped up from Decisive Strike's rework, and so, DS would be updated once again with a premature iteration of the conspicuous action system. The other moment of history that brought Unbreakable into discussion was a massive PTB cycle that Behavior would release within September 2022 of Dead by Daylight. The developers announced they wished to add a finishing Mori system into the game to make Moris more cinematic, but more importantly they wanted to help reduce slugging in the same patch. As a result, we would receive the PTB patch of 6.3.0, introducing what the community would universally accept as the base kit Unbreakable PTB cycle. In the PTB, if you were the last survivor alive and the other 3 were dead, hooked, or escaped, you and the killer would gain a new system known as Last Standing, increasing both of your FOVs and only ending if another survivor returned to the injured state. If the killer were to down the last standing survivor, both of them would teleport to a certain point on the map, and the killer Mori would play, and all other survivors in the trial would die to the entity. A cinematic experience to end the match in a colorful display. As a result, the Mori offerings would instead be updated to be blood point offerings that rewarded you for fetching the last standing Mori, a change that would happen again much later, and one that many still would greatly dislike. Outside of the last standing mechanic, there was another system that was introduced with the patch, allowing survivors left in the dying state for 45 seconds the ability to pick themselves up. Unbreakable would be updated in this patch too, now increasing the recovery speed by 100%, now taking you 22.5 seconds to allow you to fully recover, a similar time frame compared to now. As many of you realized, the patch never made it to live, and that was for 2 big reasons. The first was that Behavior themselves stated that this PTB cycle was never meant to progress into the live patch, at least not in the way they presented it. They wanted to experiment in this PTB cycle to see what worked and what failed, and over time we have seen certain elements of this PTB make it to the live patch. We have specifically seen this with the Mori update in patch 8.3.0, otherwise known as the patch Skull Merchant players will forever have PTSD over. Oh, and in the release of the animatronic, updating the system even further. Sorry, I'm starting to remember patch 8.3.0. As for everything else in the system, it never made it to the live patch, and for a very good reason. On that PTB, the strongest killers were now even stronger, as Blights and Nurses were quite literally speedrunning the game so fast that survivors would never even get the chance to use the base kit Unbreakable. And then there were the rest of the killer cast, who now only got punished. Funnily enough, killers like Twins, Trapper, and Oni were crippled by this system, as although the system had its heart set in the right place, it failed to understand that sometimes the killer really needs to slug a target. There is a strategic element to leaving a player on the ground, whether it's to snowball with your power, such as in the case of Oni or Twins, or more commonly, to avoid giving free rescues from nearby teammates. The PTB patch completely scrapped this element, and as a result either the killer was punished for picking the survivor up by blinds or pallet saves, or they recovered, punishing you for leaving them on the ground for what the developers considered too long. It was a lose-lose situation for the killer players, and to this day the system has never made a return, but it does appear to have stayed within the developers' minds, as there is an anti-slugging system in the works on the current roadmap. I do believe the developers have learned a lot during Unbreakable's time in the limelight, along with their initial test within the game. I do think they want to provide solutions to mass slugging players, which we have seen with the abandoned feature, but I also think they're trying to be careful with the system. There is a lot of nuance with slugging in the game, whether as a necessary action, an unintentional element, or as a means to snowball. All of it combines to make this slugging topic really hard to discuss. I believe the developers realized that with that PTB cycle. We can only wait to see how Behavior will implement their anti-slug system, but I do believe Unbreakable will remain as a key element for the developers when it comes to balancing the mechanic. Now we finally reach the last perk, and this is the one that everyone immediately thinks about when talking about Bill, as this is the one perk in the game that has truly changed Dead by Daylight, mostly for the better. The last perk for Bill is Borrowed Time, and when it first released, it had a completely different effect compared to today. Borrowed Time upon release was a once per trial effect perk, and upon unhooking a survivor within the killer's terror radius, both you and the unhooked survivor gain the perk's effect for 20 seconds. Upon either of you taking a hit while injured, the damage state is ignored, and you enter a bleed out timer of 40 seconds. As you may expect, this was a very young iteration of the deep wounds mechanic, as that system was not in the game at the time. As a result, to remove the bleed out timer, you needed a teammate to heal you, else you would enter the dying state. Unfortunately for Borrowed Time during this era of Dead by Daylight's lifespan, the perk was deeply flawed with its design, and to help bring up the issue, I wish to use another perk that had a similar flaw to Borrowed Time, and its old effect, that being PTB Background Player. When I talked about Background Player in my Why No One Uses video for Hinatu and Thalita, I talked about its old effect on the PTB, which was that you gained a 50% haste boost from unhooking a survivor. To give the example I used in that video, would the killer rather chase the healthy survivor running at Mach 10 towards safe tiles, or the unhooked survivor who is in a dead zone? Borrowed Time had this exact same issue back in the days of old, and if anything it was made worse by map, perk, and overall gameplay balance. The perk punished killers more for going for healthy forms of play, as now the unhooking survivor also had the bleed out timer applied to them. Sure, there's the age-old excuse of it being a once per trial effect, but we have seen perks like this destroy killer momentum, like Decisive Strike and Old Medal of Man. Additionally, it really is not once per trial within the Swift. It's a perk that can be used 4 separate times. Additionally, everything was much slower during this era for killers, and much faster for survivors. And with Swift bully squads being at their absolute strongest during this era, it made Borrowed Time even worse as a time sink for the killer. Another flaw the perk suffered from was its terror radius clause, as this allowed certain killers, like Wraith and Freddy, to ignore Borrowed Time's effects, and effortlessly go for the tunnel out, a problem that would exist for a very long time for this perk. Due to the faults of Borrowed Time, the perk would be nerfed to 25 seconds for the bleed out timer in patch 1.7.0, and finally would receive a small rework in patch 1.9.2, removing the once per trial effect and removing Borrowed Time's effects on the unhooking survivor. This was a much better version of Borrowed Time, and much healthier too, as now the killer could go for the unhooking survivor with no worries of them being safe from Borrowed Time. Additionally, Borrowed Time would finally find its mark as an anti-tunnel perk for selfless play, but the perk still had its hiccups in design. Unfortunately, there was no way to stop that bleed out timer unless you were healed by a teammate, and after the reduction of the bleed out timer to 25 seconds, tunneling killers did not have to waste too much time. Sure, Decisive Strike and Unbreakable were available during that era, with DS being in its strongest state then, but you were running 2 perks to resolve a big annoyance on 1 perk that you needed your teammate to bring. Behavior saw this, and as a result the perk would be updated once again, in patch 2.4.0, otherwise known as the release of Legion and Jeff. Legion was the killer who introduced the deep wounds mechanic, and as a result the developers wished to experiment with the system, and Borrowed Time had a similar function with its bleed out effect, resulting in the perk getting another rework. Borrowed Time during patch 2.4.0 now had the effect of placing the unhooked survivor with the endurance effect for 15 seconds, down from the 20 of before, and if the killer applied a damage state to the survivor during this time, they would now enter Deep Wound. The perk would get changed once again in patch 3.4.0, specifically to how Deep Wounds worked, as the timer paused in chase rather than running, resulting in killers moonwalking you to death, or more specifically, Legion at the time. Outside of Deep Wound's initial hiccup in design, this was overall a very wonderful change. It rewarded survivors who could push the effects of Borrowed Time to its limits, and punished tunneling killers even further, as they now needed to deliver the final blow to properly secure the tunnel out. The perk would then over the years get its numbers modified over time, from patch 4.5.0 increasing the duration to 20 seconds again, and patch 4.7.0 reducing it to 12 seconds, but removing that terror radius clause. That change in particular was a really lovely change for both sides, now allowing borrow time to protect survivors from all killers and not being ignored by stealth killers who could go for the tunnel out, but the timer was nicer for killers who needed to go for the tunnel out for the endgame. One last thing to note about borrowed time before we discuss its latest change is its pick rate, as this perk was one of the most picked perks in the game, bolstering an almost 45% pick rate in survivor builds. This was because the anti-tunnel system did not exist within this era of Dead by Daylight, and with new killers surviving who could tunnel much more maliciously than an M1 trapper, and not be as punished as severely, the survivors' only choices were Decisive Strike and Borrowed Time, resulting in their over-bloated pick rates. Behavior knew this, and as a result would update the game with one of their largest balance changes to date, that being patch 6.1.0. This is funnily enough one of my favorite patches in Dead by Daylight's history, as not only did the patch update 40 perks and introduce changes to slow the game down for killers and speed up their lethality, but it also introduced the system most commonly referred to as Base Kit BT. The effects of borrowed time were quite literally made as a base kit feature within the game, as now any survivor unhooked would now gain endurance for 5 seconds, along with a 7% haste boost too. This effect would later on be buffed in patch 6.2.0, the release of Project W, to 10 seconds of duration, and the haste being increased to 10%. Overall, a wonderful change that helped to remove strain from Decisive Strike and Borrowed Time, allowing survivors more options for build diversity rather than feeling forced to bring a perk to resolve a problem. As for Borrowed Time, the perk was reworked once again, now to extend the base kit Borrowed Time system's durations, both for haste and endurance, by 10 seconds, and that is how the perk has been left. Overall, the system has had its fair share of good and bad. On one side, it did not completely kill off tunneling, as players would relearn how to dodge the system, and for survivors, they abused it as a means to go for body blocks to force the killer to hit them while protected. On the other hand, the system has helped to punish tunneling play with the benefits that Borrowed Time provided as a perk, specifically by giving survivors a layer of defense upon being unhooked, and with the extra haste, you could now reach much safer areas. This system would later on be expanded upon by other perks, like Babysitter, Off the Record, No One Left Behind, and I believe the system has overall been a good addition to the game. It's not the most flawless system, obviously, we still have many players finding every measure to abuse it, and we have seen many killers finding ways to completely mitigate its value, but we cannot deny how useful it has been to reduce the overall power of tunneling before its introduction. It has only been a net positive, especially for the trenches of the solo queue battlefield, and compared to before, where you were forced to run one perk to resolve a major issue, I have no qualms with its inclusion. With that being said, there is nothing left to discuss about Borrowed Time. It has now unfortunately faded from its glory days of being a must-pick perk, and now hovers within the 1% pick rate range on nightlight.gg. This is incredibly sad to see, but I don't believe it's because the perk has become unusable. If anything, the perk still has a really strong effect. The loss in pick rate is more so because of the introduction of the anti-tunnel system, new perks introduced to help with the fight, and most importantly, because the perk is no longer a necessity to run. Borrowed Time is a perk that is truly one of the most interesting within the game, as its effects of promoting healthy play is one that resulted in behavior adapting its initial effect into the core's game balance. Additionally, it shows how perk pick rates can be inflated depending on the meta play at the time, and most importantly, how much players consider the necessity of running it. Borrowed Time, in my opinion, is one of the most important perks to ever arrive in Dead by Daylight, and I believe it deserves some rest, especially after everything it has done to help improve the game. Before ending the video, I wish to provide all of you with some build paths that focus on all three of Bill's teachable perks. The first set focuses on Left Behind's identity and helping you to find the hatch when you are the last survivor standing, with the second build in particular focusing around enhancing the key's add-on potential, and with that rework, it's going to be really nice. Unbreakable is a perk that has received a lot of support over the years, so there's a ton of variety that you can pull off with this perk. I will only list 2 builds in particular, as that is the rules I normally follow, but Unbreakable realistically can be slapped onto any build by itself, and still provide you value. Additionally, I recommend watching out for the plot twist combo, as Unbreakable's pickup effect is removed once you fully heal with plot twist. Borrow Time 2 has a very flexible design, and it can realistically be run alone, but the 2 builds I am providing are very entertaining options for Anti-Tunnel, especially the first, as it helps enhance Shoulder the Burden even further. There is nothing much else to say about Bill. He is a character who arrived during a very unstable time for Dead by Daylight's lifespan, but the perks he brought were truly lights in the dark for what they were. There is no denying there were flaws to their designs early on, but behavior managed to iron out their issues, and we have been left with some truly beautifully designed perks. It is a shame not to see Bill or his perks as much as before, and it hurts even more when people forget his inclusion, and its importance. But there are those special few who do care to remember, and considering the Gnome minigame of years ago, I suspect behavior do care to remember Bill's importance too, which makes me quite happy. But what do you all think about Bill's perks, and how they influence the game? Do you all believe that behavior made the smart decision on using the perks as benchmarks for base game balance, or was there something else that they could have done? In any case, I cannot wait to read your thoughts in the comments, and I wish you all the best of luck in your trials. You will need it, especially as we see the inclusion of The Walking Dead.